Hello. I believe very strongly in music ethics. I believe in awakening. I believe in awakening the consciousness of the student who is, by essence, in a quest. And the teacher should not be the one to give the answers or pretend to have them. Rather channel and flourish and even eventually blossom the search of the student for themselves. After all, no revealed truth exists. We perceive the experience of past music as being the one we understand in our points of view. And I find that very arrogant to try to tell a student this piece is meaningful because, it's beautiful because. Straight talk about form, about style, about taste, about obviously tradition, perhaps even comparing traditions and then lineage, and then try to understand the music in the cultural context of its own time. Was it meant to be universal so it becomes present today when it's the past? While it was its own present, in its own time. And why does it mean too much, so much to us? And why are we so puzzled by the music of today in turn? Is it because it's so mysteriously spread in different directions that we are sort of lost in translation on the paths ahead? Or is it that we have false admirations for things that are very impressive but perhaps not very deep, like how difficult it is, how complex it is, what kind of different language it explores, and therefore in interpretation how fast it's played and how amazingly loud it is. And of course those things are not reductive, and of course they're important. After all, music is the translation of life in its best expectation, dreams and realization. It sort of talks to the psyche, I guess, culturally in general, but also in particular for the heroism in us, at whichever level we correspond to heroism. After all, heroes can be the survivors of the day, and heroes can be also the mindless fear killers. After all, fear is part of the heroism, and therefore doubt is part of the musical interpretation. I'm deeply convinced that it's inspiring to hear how a piece which you've grown up with age to shape into the understanding of what it is not, in order to shape and keep the essence of what it is, either by the way you are taught, either by the way you grew up to understand it and perhaps changed mind on the way, and then inevitably in the transmission to a younger generation or even same generation, regardless of the generation. In the fact of transmitting, there is something about that's what I understood, and therefore I hold it for certain. And if it's not certain in the eyes of the student who has to build some kind of a trust, then what happens is that the student is comparing the teacher's opinion to any other opinion, the visible part of the iceberg, the tip only, which appears in recordings, in captured recordings of concert performances, availability of, in fact, comparison shopping, so to say, about tempo, articulation, tradition, ornamentation, decoration, all the questions that most of the students ask in a sort of binary way, should it be or not, fast or slow, etc. So of course the certainty that has to be given to the student is a case by case. Not all students have the same quests, and not all students have the same necessity to search for themselves, Sehnsucht. I think some of them are satisfied at a certain stage of their development to just receive the information, and they just filter it through themselves without too much compartmentation. It's just straight, streamlined. It creates schools. We say, oh, I can hear the playing of such and such in that. or that or this or the style of this, I can find that it's a better taste in the interpretation of this or this, another. But of course, the good taste is only in the eye of the beholder. As they say for politicians, the promises are only kept by those who hear them. And sometimes I think the promise of teaching is to open the mind for the truly curious students, not to lesser the factual knowledge that they have to receive, and through us, teachers, individually or collectively, but there are certainties have to be given, and therefore that certainty can be questioned and should be questioned, but not at the get-go, without which there is a loss in front of this apparent anything goes freedom. Of course, the strictness way we were taught in my generation by teachers, in my case from the 19th century mindset, since they were born into it, it was all about strict. So the encouragement or the patience and the expectations were at a different levels than today, either because students are today somehow more involved in several tasks at the same time. They're opening themselves to be good at several trades, and they're not willing to put all their eggs in one basket. Let's trust all that basket with one farmer. And so the teacher is either the example, either to follow, either the agitator of thoughts. And I like to think that that is what I think it should be for the ethics of teaching, of music making, beyond imitating or trying to emulate, which is part of the mimetism of studying. It's part of human beings. We watch each other and we react in mirrors. Like some people have more the sort of psychology of the herd, and then some are the odd ducks that have to go against it. They really don't know why, but they feel like they don't fit intellectually, and it takes a lot of courage to even accept it and understand it, let less for the student but also for the teacher. So it's very challenging for the teacher too. Beyond having been a student, the times are not the same between our studies and theirs for our students. I think the mindset changed so fast, faster than in generations before, even if I'm sure every generation before must have thought, my God, this is totally old-fashioned, we need to do something else. You know, Schumann with the Neue Zeitschrift für Musik, Debussy with the whole tone, Schubert didn't, but well, he did, but subtly. Schoenberg needed to also tabula rasa, clean the deck and start from the beginning and reinvent the order of the notes, let less of the organization of them. And all of these things are proven to be the fact, like Beethoven didn't really accept Haydn's school. Though he is, by essence of the time period in which he fell, to be, as we never choose really, he was rambunctious, and he managed to break the shell. And in order to present the music that meant to him, compared to Mendelssohn or Mozart, who just seemed to glide on a heavenly facility of their expression, without having to fight the status quo. Perhaps they don't fight it because they're cowards, obviously. They don't fight it because their facilities for melodic invention and for flowing of voice leading is so self-evident that is blinding them from trying to be, let's say, in a battle with a tradition. And they don't need to fight, since what they bring is such evidence that even today we think these melodic lines are self-evident, but they didn't exist before they wrote them, obviously. And I think that we are in a time period where a lot of books have been written about music more than before in an accumulative way. more editions have been published in an accumulative way, some trying to cancel the preceding ones because of the urtext and the research for the truth between the notation that is not obviously the thought of the composer, or the composers who didn't really notate the way they played it, or wanted it to be played, if they could have played it themselves, but they didn't write it only for them, even if it's for most of the cases through them. Let's say Rachmaninoff, Scriabin, Mettner, Chopin, Liszt, compared to Beethoven, or even Bartók, as he was a great pianist in the terms of pianism. But other composers were not so much finger-oriented for their thought process through the keyboard, I mean. Of course, organists like Bach, opera composers like Mozart, Tchaikovsky, typically mood setting with the ballets in the symphonies. But of course, we cannot limit them just to that. It's just that I think we perceive them as coming from such inspirational streamline to us. And I find it fascinating because today the choice is big, and therefore the trust for the teacher, it has to be earned. And it has to be earned with an open mind by the teacher, while installing straight rules, which by essence have to be broken, but later, and by the student, for having understood the purpose of these limitations, which trigger us to search for something further. The refinement comes not only in the idea or the inspiration or the initial thrust, it comes also through the shaping of the thought process, the learning of the grammar that supplements the intuitive ear for the musician. And then learning how to notate these thoughts, would it be even as an interpretation to indicate which phrasing, which sub-phrasing, where it starts, where it ends, how to do. After all, I find it fascinating that the notation, which should be our teacher's ally to convince the student of what our conviction is of the thought of the composers, which we pretend to wish to determine, even if filtered by our own love of the piece, or perhaps understanding of the piece if we don't love all pieces we teach. At least we are thorough and honest in the sense of trying to convey what the composer wanted, or what we think the composer wanted. And therefore, when the students enter in this situation, they have to find their own place. And I know that the rules are there very importantly to ban from getting lost in freedom. And then there are those bounds that need to be broken in order to create their own understanding that comes from partly ours or many of us. It's not like a pick and choose. It's more like, I would say, digest and produce. Sometimes I find it incredibly inspiring to hear how a student at an earlier age, compared to the teacher's age, reaches a level of wisdom through their own intellectual filter. Would it be because of their intellect in general, or their connection of the intellect with their heart, soul, or intuition? Therefore, the grammar that is added as a learning process, compared to the intuitive hearing, would it be of the language or the music as a language? And I find it very fascinating how for some students these questions are not fully present. They're sort of like embedded in their intuition, like as if in a sandwich, and they don't really layer out everything before to put it back together. And teaching is two ways. Either you say, play like me, and you give the example, and then you have to have a sort of a photographic memory for the, or therefore some kind of auditive memory. Or, and, but that is a question of balancing, the explanation of every choice detail, which ornament from the upper note, why not, and in which context, and in which exception, and how it applies, that all of a sudden you can contradict yourself as a teacher by having said something and then say, ah, but this is an ambiguous situation because the composer sort of hinted an accompaniment, but then in fact it mingles with the melody. But did we really know if he really wanted or not? And if we need to use the middle pedal, which would better organize the layers, perhaps he didn't want that because the sound, the color, the blur, the mix, the sauce, the soup of sounds organized in a way that their resonance creates an unforgettable atmosphere more than only their layered hearing, orchestrally or instrumentally for the solo instrument. There is a lot of back and forth in that between the sole color of the instrument, the piano, versus an orchestra that has multiple colors of instruments. And I think that pianists and musicians should be all in one in the fact that by the time they study a sonata by Beethoven, they have to study symphonies of Beethoven. Not study them to conduct them, not even study them to play them on the piano like Liszt did for Beethoven, or transcriptions that can be done, and I'm very keenly in love with making such myself. But beyond that, to just know them, to bathe in them, to bathe in the musical but also intellectual world in which these authors bathed. They didn't compose art ex nihilo and decide that they're going to just come up with a 12th tone out of nowhere, or that they would pursue tonal systems because in a way they are just sort of like blindly bound to it. I think that we don't have a lot of source materials about the thought processes unless we have some very rare from the past kept correspondence where they write about their thoughts, where they open about their intellectual doubts and hopes and worries. That would be very insightful. But then again, it also can be very stressful for a student because it sort of drops the elements in too many directions. So how to filter all that in a sensitive way and keep having the music travel with you and us and them and you in age, through age, like pattern of travel, toiletries that you carry with you. And I think in a way there is an intimate connection for that sense of that image of toiletries that we care and we have with music that we play on the piano. It's very intimate. It's not only for the others. It's not only because we have stage fright and we try not to betray what we love of the piece, because obviously the more you admire, the least you want to break what you admire. But beyond these contingencies, I think it's an intimate, intellectual and sensual, perhaps even, but for sure mystical relation with a music piece which grows in you through the years, reveals itself even better through some students playing, perhaps unknown to themselves, but somehow it brings you to also realize that the dots meet differently according to this articulation, this tempo, and this point of view, which you might reject at the get-go and then find that there is an alternative path to go through the garden that you thought you knew all of the paths of. Of course, it takes very much humility from the point of view of the person who's supposed to know. And at the same time, the transgressive interpretation by saying me first is a little bit to be also carefully nurtured, but also kept in check for the student, because if everything is allowed in the name of it means that to me, then unless you compose your own music in which you're sort of creating the universe that you would like to be played. If you play the universe of another composer, even if you like it to have gone further in the direction, less in this direction, perhaps indulge more in this, and you try to customize it interpretationally by going to the verge of interpretation and recomposition on the borderline, which is sometimes for some considered, of course, wrong. And so you navigate in situations where you feel like in order to play the piece, to translate the piece, you have first to hear the piece, read the score in a way that it answers some of your questions about the phrase structure, about the storytelling. Is it a poem? Is it a free narration? Is it a suspended dominant? Does it give us a sense of, through the harmonic language of the melodic line, bringing to tension without release, or a release immediately after a given tension because of the tonal system? And if it's atonal, how to organize those notes, or how they are organized in order to give you the series that fascinate you intellectually, and even more, for many fascinates them emotionally. But of course, the more educated, the more able to access these complexities. But let's go down back to the point of the student who is not the most curious, with knowledge about rare composers who are forgotten by history, and would like still to cover the basics which make what they think a pianist be a pianist, the ballades by Chopin, the music of Liszt and Rachmaninoff, and what everything that is in fact written by composer pianists. But also the sonatas by Beethoven, because it's the form and it's also the instrument, the fortepiano's first complete set that is not coming from the harpsichord for the inspiration and the construction and the texture. And by the time you cover a lot of these concerti by Mozart, by Romantics, by the time you cover the meaning of how to understand, translate, and ultimately beyond teach, also sort of educate in performance audiences for fugues and other intellectual organizations of music. Of course, nobody pretends ultimately that there is an A and a Z, an alpha and an omega to the learning process. But there have to be boundaries. If not, there is no end to it. And the plethora of information might end up by discouraging the student. And the student has to build also technically for the piano very big securities. So therefore, to feel confident that on an unknown instrument, he or she will be able to obtain more than less of their intentions. And that more and less of the intentions will translate in the audience into their temporary assessment, saying, I assess that by now this is what it means to me. And it's almost like as if you decide not to repaint the painting every day, but to rethink about it and say, perhaps I should have, and make another painting or correct that painting. If you're a painter and you're focused on one figure and one single inspirational figure, or if it's not figurative, mood or atmosphere or perspective. Music has so many ways to enter into, from the pulse to the melodic to the harmonic to the lack of, if it's atonal or differently harmonized. Therefore, how far is it from the human psyche without knowledge about the language? Or how can one, without to get lost in translation, reach the heart of the music and perhaps even misunderstand it, but with such conviction that it becomes, as a performer, for given audiences who hear this performer, it becomes contagious. They love it, and they don't like it by anybody else, even if perhaps somebody else plays it more correctly according to scholars and book writers, as well as musicologists. Therefore, who define a lot of the thinking of the music compared to the performers who sort of define the making of the music in real time, and the composers who are sort of mysteriously appearing around, mostly dead and if alive relatively bothering, because they bring in their own concept of what's supposed to be as if they know best because it's their own. But in fact, the notation allows for so many in between the lines different ways of understanding that it becomes, thankfully, a beautiful journey for each initiatic journey to initiate yourself with the prelude fugues, the sonatas, the dances, the partitas, the ballades, the free poems, the tone poems, the different forms of repetitive music, the spoken music, the sung music, the articulation that is to imitate an instrument that is not, or an orchestra which it could call for, learn about things and hear about things, and perhaps in the mix misunderstand in a way that makes sense for yourself. Have a flexible, adaptive intelligence to not always start from a given point until you reach the next point, because then it seems like the intellectual process takes too long, and for some people is reassuring, but technically, yes, you have to acquire a technique. For instance, the phrasing will be a determining direction that has to be defined by the teacher and the publisher, obviously, if not recordings, by a combination of those to find which fingering corresponds to the morphology of the individual student, how stretchy the fingers are in between, how independent the single tendon connected fingers are. Somehow, for some trills are easier than thirds, and for others, octaves are easier than, let's say, other ornaments. Nothing is easy for most, and anyway, nothing is easy, period. But there are some physical advantages for having longer fingers, not that one chose them. And I always see students complain, either the hand is too small, either the hand is too long. I mean, the fingers are too long, depending of the pieces they play. A Scarlatti sonata and a Mozart sonata, they feel if it's long fingers, they don't know where to bend them enough to not play wrong notes, because they have all these fingers around. And then when they play spread music that is written in dispositions from Schumann to Rachmaninoff through, that gives the impression that you can almost grasp the whole keyboard with your two hands. No, I think the teacher is there to say you're blessed to have the hand you have and you have the ear you have. And if it's not trained enough, we're going to help you train it. Because even if you have a perfect pitch, it doesn't mean that you hear everything knowing what you hear. You could define what you hear once you know what it's supposed to be, that you're hearing. And so, yes, there are some facilities that are given to some. We call it talent, or we call it genius, or we call it, oh my God, how do they do it without to know? And we're fascinated when a long process of learning that takes decades, if not more, appears to be self-evident to a child prodigy, and then one feels at best jealous, at worst discouraged in front of such phenomenons where the intuition supplements, or supplants, in this case, replaces the knowledge. But ultimately, everybody grows up, and thankfully, today life expectancy in most countries is longer than it used to be, when the composers we serve of the past used to die in their 30s, for too many of them. Therefore, today we can afford to, while struggling financially and in personal lives, to make ends meet. Still, we have more time, so to say, between not being always hungry or always worried about paying one's dues to one's rent and livelihood. Beyond that way, we consider today almost slavery that a Haydn and a Vivaldi and a Scarlatti and the others had to go through, a Bach, a week cantata. But for them, it was like the nirvana, the best job they could get, because in comparison in the context. So today I think we do have more time, even if we always are out of time, but which is true because we're sort of distracted in many directions, and probably we're nourished by these distractions, which is healthy too, as long as we manage again to filter it ourselves. But really, I'm fascinated by the thought processes of others, regardless if they're musicians, philosophers, writers, or handymen, or people who know how to do well something that means to them. And I like that to say often that craftsmanship is as valuable as arts, and arts is not less valuable than between the intellect and the let's say circus activity of performing. There's nothing more noble and less noble. I think some people have attitude, arrogance, condescendence. They think that they own truths because they come from this or that lineage, artistically or musically. It gives them this sense of superiority. And to a certain extent, I think admiration is part of love, even between humans without music. But when it is around that, you have to admire in order to accept it. Teaching, even if you would reject aspects of it because you're yourself. And you don't do it directly in front of the teacher, perhaps in order to just confront for the sake of confrontation, unless you have this kind of rambunctious character. And that happens too. And I don't think teachers should think that all students have to be just linear flows of rivers, and we are the bridges and we just oversee. No, I think we are in the same boat, to continue on this fluvial imagery. And I find that there is no certainty in the truth, which they learn when they break the boundaries that we give them in order to understand why they have to have them. And ultimately, in turn, is like when children become parents, they understand better, or perhaps they accuse even more the way they were treated when they were children. And so when you're a teacher and you've been a student, you say, well, I'll be a teacher one day if I am. You tell yourself those promises. I'm not going to impose this fingering. I'm not going to sing because I want to present the line, because it's silly, the voice of a non-singer singing. But how do I externalize my love for the piece, my conviction of the piece, my inner translating the inner landscape that the piece represents for me, at least at that point of my life. And I find that when I see students grow and become even more mature, even if they were already, and carry the fruits of their own harvest in their recordings or their performances or their compositions, I am moved. Not that I find any of the little humble contribution that I might have or not left to them, while I find that the way in the uncertainty of everything, their construction fascinates me. And I find that very humbling. For the true ethics, as I said in the beginning of this meeting with all of you, each and all of you. Yeah, this is very much my conviction, that the ethics is to be open-minded and to be accepting of the difference of the other, to be tolerant before to reject, to prepare to love before to say I don't understand, to try again, over and over, and to evolve in one's certainties about what one knows. And it's healthy, and I think is possibly why you see very often very old teachers be very young in spirit. I don't think it's only because they keep repeating themselves, but it's also because while they appear to do so, I think they are influenced by the fresh thinking that comes from a student's point of view. And it doesn't happen every day. It doesn't happen every week, every month. Perhaps it happens from time to time. But regardless, one has to appreciate these moments where we have a transmission of humanity, of humankind, not so much only of a skill, or through the skill, the capacity to question and understand what humankind achieved. And I'm always fascinated of how much was achieved for this field by composers who lived in difficult conditions, with wars and with lack of any sanitary advances as today or medical, and tirelessly managed to squeeze out of their brain and of their heart, if we consider the siege of Saul, but regardless, from their spiritual and their inspirational being, to give us the best of themselves, not willingly or not knowingly, because time spent, probably they didn't think of us, for sure. We think of them as if we knew them, perhaps through their works more than by having only studied about them. But the works of them are almost bigger than themselves too. And so we become the recipients of something which we didn't instigate, but which becomes part of our heritage to transmit. There's no right or wrong. It's misguessed and ill understood, possibly. And I like to be that when I teach, while I want to make sure that the right fingering corresponds to a phrasing that corresponds to a direction that makes you, in fact, be legible by the listener. And a well-prepared gesture doesn't lead to a wrong note. An ill-prepared gesture does. Even if the stars are well aligned, sometimes difficult sections go through somehow, as pianists know about that. There is no full certainty either, but there are fingerings and dispositions between the hands that are not always part of the notation, regardless if it was in the composer's intention or they're edited by the publisher. I think the teacher comes somewhere between the publisher and originally the composer to the student. And then the student becomes the performer, in this case pianist, and teacher, and then the chain on and goes, and on and on and on and on. And it makes it meaningful to live. Really does. Thank you.